The moment my father said it, I watched my grandfather's hand pause mid-reach for his whiskey glass. His jaw tightened. He set the glass down with a deliberate clink that seemed to echo through the entire country club ballroom, and he looked at me across the table with an expression I'd only ever seen once before. The same expression he wore the day he found out my mother had left us without saying goodbye. My name is Raven. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the reunion that changed everything. It was June 14th, 2019, at 4:42 p.m., when my father, Richard, decided to be honest about what he really thought of me. We were at the Whitmore Country Club in Boston, Massachusetts, where my family has held their annual reunion for 37 consecutive years. The room was full of cousins, aunts, uncles, and the kind of people who measure their worth in real estate portfolios and inherited silver. My father stood up with his hand on my brother's shoulder, my younger brother Marcus, who at 31 years old had never worked a day in his life, and announced to the entire gathering that he was giving Marcus the family property, the 7 million square foot oceanfront estate in Cape Cod, the one assessed at $2.5 million, the one my father had spent 42 years acquiring and perfecting. My father said, and I quote because I wrote down every word that night, "Marcus is finally becoming the man this family needs. Raven's always been too sharp, too distant, too unwilling to just enjoy what we've built." I didn't move. I didn't cry. I counted the seconds between his words and my grandfather's silence. What my father didn't know was that exactly 73 days earlier, my grandfather had called me into his study and given me something. That's where this story actually begins. 3 months before the reunion, before the announcement, before everything unraveled in the way I'd quietly been preparing for, I grew up in a house where love was conditional and measured in square footage. My father, Richard Hayes, was a man who could buy affection but never quite achieve it. He built his identity on being the success of his generation, the one with the biggest house, the most impressive title, the children who reflected his ambitions rather than his actual love. My mother left when I was 7 years old. I remember the morning she left, the coffee still warm on the counter, her silk scarf folded on the kitchen chair like she might come back and claim it in 5 minutes. She didn't. For 30 years, she didn't come back. My brother Marcus, 2 years younger than me, became my father's blank canvas. Everything Richard couldn't mold me into, he poured into Marcus. And Marcus, ever eager to be loved, obliged. He dropped out of college. He stayed in his childhood bedroom. He agreed with everything my father believed. For my father, this was loyalty. For everyone else, it was a tragedy. My grandfather, William Cole, was different. He was a quiet man with careful hands and a mind that worked like mathematics. Precise, logical, remembering everything. While my father was out making money and building his empire, my grandfather was teaching me to read the silence in rooms. He showed me how people's faces betrayed what their mouths wouldn't admit. "Watch them when they think nobody's looking," he told me when I was 12. Sitting in his study with its mahogany walls and walls of books bound in leather that smelled like old rain and possibility. That's when you see who they really are. I thought it was just his way of teaching me to be observant. I didn't understand it was a warning. By the time I was 28 years old, I was working as a forensic accountant in Boston. I was the person companies hired when they suspected someone was stealing from them. I was the one who followed the money, traced the lies, and turned numbers into evidence. It was a gift, my grandfather would say, this ability to see what others missed. It was also lonely. People don't trust someone who can look at their finances and see their secrets. My father had spent years trying to make me feel small for my career choice. "Forensic accounting," he'd say with a dismissive laugh at family dinners. Like she's CSI for spreadsheets. The table would laugh because my father's laugh always set the tone. But my grandfather never laughed at those moments. He'd take a long drink of water, set down his fork, and change the subject to ask me about my latest case. Not the details, he was too discreet for that, but the broader question of how I felt doing work that mattered. That question saved me more than once. 73 days before the reunion, my grandfather asked me to come see him. Not for Sunday dinner or a casual visit. He asked me to clear my afternoon. I remember the date because I noted it in my calendar. March 23, 2019. He was 87 years old then, though he moved like someone 20 years younger. We sat in his study, the same one where he'd taught me to read rooms, and he placed an envelope on the desk between us. It was thick, official-looking, stamped with the seal of Caldwell and Associates, the law firm that had represented our family for 4 generations. "I'm giving you something," he said, his voice exactly the way it always sounded, measured, final, kind. "Not because you need it or asked for it, but because I need you to have it. Because I know what's coming, and I want you to be prepared." I opened the envelope. Inside was a document. A will. A new will dated 2 weeks earlier, with my grandfather's signature notarized and witnessed by the law firm. I scanned it, my accounting mind immediately grasping what I was reading. My grandfather had restructured his entire estate. Everything. The property holdings, the investment accounts, the family trusts established in 1947 had been reallocated. And in that reallocation, there was something else. A clause. A condition. A note that explained everything. "Read it 3 times, my grandfather said. Then seal it and don't tell anyone. Not your father, not Marcus, not until the moment it matters." I remember asking him why. I remember his face, calm, sad, and absolutely certain. "Because some things need to be revealed all at once," he said, "or they'll be twisted before they land. Your father's been making decisions based on lies he's told himself about who you are. Your brother's been living a life based on what your father needed him to be. And I've been watching this for 6 decades, waiting for the right moment to tell the truth." He stood up, placed his hand on my shoulder, and said something I didn't fully understand until that moment at the reunion. "The receipts matter more than the performance." I left with that envelope. I placed it in a safety deposit box at my bank, account number 2847639, access granted only to me. I didn't read it again for exactly 71 days. And for those 71 days, I watched my father. I watched him purchase a new car, a $187,000 Mercedes, to celebrate Marcus's maturity. I watched him brag about giving Marcus a generous allowance. I watched him rewrite the family narrative in his mind, turning years of neglect into expecting too much from me. The reunion was held on a Saturday. I wore a simple black dress, nothing that would draw attention. I arrived at 3:15 p.m. My father and Marcus arrived at 3:47 p.m., and I watched my father's face light up in a way it never did when I arrived. 83 people were present. I counted them. I also counted the 17 relatives who went suddenly quiet when my father made his announcement. I watched my mother's best friend, Aunt Helen, who'd always shown me kindness, turn pale. I watched my brother's girlfriend, Jessica, look at Marcus with an expression that contained the beginning of the end of their relationship. And I watched my grandfather stand up. Slowly. Methodically. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was the loudest thing in that room. He walked over to my father and put his hand on his arm. "Richard," he said, "we need to talk. Now. In my office." My father started to protest, but the tone of my grandfather's voice, the same tone I'd heard when he told me to seal the envelope, made it clear this wasn't a request. They were gone for 11 minutes. I know because I counted the seconds. When they returned, my father's face had drained of all color. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't name. Betrayal, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding what he'd lost. My grandfather returned to his seat and looked directly at me. He nodded. One small movement. That was my signal. I stood up. The room went silent. 73 seconds of silence. I counted this one, too. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. I need to read something, I said, my voice steady and quiet. My grandfather asked me to share this with all of you. It's the codicil to his will, the one dated March 23, 2019, the updated one. My father started to move toward me. My Uncle Richard, his own brother, put a hand on his arm. I began to read. The document was precise, legal, and devastating in the way that truth often is. My grandfather had restructured his entire estate. The Cape Cod property, the one my father had just promised to Marcus, was being placed in a trust. But not a trust for Marcus. A trust that would provide for Marcus's education, his health care, his genuine needs, but no access to the principal until age 45, with mandatory financial literacy training. The property itself would be maintained by the family trust, with my grandfather's attorney as trustee. My grandfather had also restructured his investment accounts, and he'd allocated $1.2 million of his personal wealth into a separate account. An account in my name. Not as a gift, the document stated, as restitution. Restitution for what? My father's voice cracked when I read that word aloud. I continued reading. The will explained, in my grandfather's precise language, that he had observed patterns in Richard's behavior toward his daughter that he considered emotionally neglectful. It explained that he had watched Richard repeatedly prioritize Marcus based on what Richard needed rather than who his children actually were. It explained that my grandfather was using his remaining years and resources to correct what he saw as a profound injustice. But here's where it became devastating. The will stated that if Richard contested this decision in any way, if he challenged the trust or attempted to reverse any of these allocations, the $1.2 million would be donated to a scholarship fund for low-income women entering forensic accounting and law enforcement. My father actually laughed. It was a sound like a bone breaking. "He's lost his mind," he said to no one in particular. But my grandfather's attorney, who had appeared in the doorway with another witness, simply shook his head. "William Cole is currently undergoing cognitive assessment by 3 independent physicians," the attorney said, her voice the professional kind of calm that only lawyers can manage. "All 3 have verified his competency. The will is airtight. He's had us review it 6 times." The room erupted, not in outrage, in something worse. In the quiet, terrible sound of people beginning to accept a truth they didn't want to believe about someone they thought they knew. My father looked at me, and for the first time in my 34 years, I saw him actually see me. Not what he'd projected onto me, not what he'd wanted me to be. Me. Just me. And it was clear that he had no idea who that was. I didn't celebrate. I've never been someone who celebrates other people's pain, even when they've caused pain themselves. But I also didn't apologize for the truth. I simply gathered my phone, looked at my grandfather, and we left together. In the car ride back to his apartment, we didn't talk about the will or the confrontation. We talked about my current case, a company where the CFO had been embezzling for 7 years, hiding it in subsidiary accounts. We talked about how some people spend their entire lives running from the truth while standing in the middle of it. We talked about how my grandfather had been watching, remembering everything, and waiting for the moment when he could no longer wait. 3 weeks later, my father called me. His voice was different. Not warm, not suddenly loving, but quieter. He asked if we could have lunch. We met at a restaurant in downtown Boston on a Tuesday at 12:30 p.m., and he ordered something he never ate and didn't touch. He told me that he'd been in therapy. He told me that my grandfather's will had forced him to look at 34 years of choices he'd been running from. He told me that he was sorry. And then he said something that broke my heart in a different way. "I don't know how to fix this." I told him the truth. "You probably can't," I said. "But you could stop trying to pretend it didn't happen." That would be something. 6 months later, my brother Marcus called me. He'd moved out of our father's house. He'd started taking classes at Boston University. He'd gotten into a relationship with someone who actually saw him. He didn't apologize for the will or the inheritance or the years he'd let our father shape him. But he did say, "I hated that it took Grandpa to make things clear. I wish I'd been brave enough to see it myself." Sometimes that's all you get. My grandfather lived another 3 years after that reunion. In those 3 years, he watched my career flourish. He watched me start my own consulting firm, Raven Cole Associates, specializing in financial crimes against women and small businesses. He watched me use that $1.2 million to open a scholarship fund of my own. Not spitefully, but genuinely. He watched me build a life that was actually mine, not the life someone else had decided I should want. On the morning of his funeral, I didn't cry. I sat in the church and felt the weight of all the years he'd been watching, remembering, waiting. In his will, his final will, he left me something else. A letter, in his handwriting. It said, "The receipts matter more than the performance. You taught me that without knowing it. Keep watching, keep remembering, keep rising." That's what I've been doing ever since. If you felt what I was feeling in that story, that quiet certainty that comes when you stop hoping someone will change and start preparing for them to remain themselves, tell me in the comments. And if you know someone who needed to hear that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm and let the truth speak louder than emotion, share this with them. If you're new here, subscribe. Another story is waiting. Thank you for being here all the way to the end.